Hello, everybody, and welcome to Muse's AT Podcast, where you can relive my epic journey with me. This is Muse, and what follows is my Appalachian Trail story. Today's episode covers Tuesday, June 3rd, 2025. And you will have noticed right here from the get-go that I have taken the energy level down quite a bit. We've got some heavy stuff to talk about today, and I'm going to pull a lot of that into the intro so that as we make the turn out of the entry and into the commentary, I can kind of get into some of the lighter material that I want to cover. There were some tragic events in early June that did intersect with my Appalachian Trail story, and I'm, again, pulling the energy level down just to be as respectful as possible to those events and to the people in them. So even though we will get a little bit lighter as I turn to the commentary, I will keep this a little bit of a quieter episode throughout. I'm going to cut all of my music and won't insert any ads into this one. First, before we get into how it impacted me, I want to tell you what these events were. On June 1st, 2025, 2 days before the day we're covering, Tim and Esther Katahdin, father-daughter duo, were up on Mount Katahdin and they lost their lives. Tim was 58 years old, Esther was 28, and those search efforts began on June 2nd when it was discovered that their car didn't leave the parking lot after they ascended on June 1st. On the morning of June 3rd, they ended up finding Tim's body. They would ultimately find Esther's body the next afternoon on June 4th. And so, as I mentioned, I'm going to address how this impacted me, what impact this had on Muse's Appalachian Trail story. But before I do, I just want to give a quick moment of silence so that we can properly end cap those facts. Okay, the entry you're going to hear today is actually written on the morning of June 4th. It's the June 3rd entry, but it's written on the morning of June 4th, which wasn't altogether uncommon. That's actually early on often how I would do it. I tend to be a little bit more of a morning person anyway, and so that writing might have actually happened on the next morning before I got going. Later in the hike, I actually would end up writing several days later and stacking a bunch of stuff together, but we'll talk about that again later. The reason I mentioned that the entry was actually written early on Wednesday, June 4th, is because the tragedy that I just mentioned, the Katahdin deaths, it hit me really hard, but it also took a while to hit me. I don't know, being there that day, it was like being saturated in this news for the entire day. And as you'll hear when we do get into the commentary, it's some good, some exciting, some fun things were happening that day. And so it actually took me literally all day for it to really sink in. It was actually when relating this news to Carrie in the evening, I had called her, and that's when it kind of hit me. And I woke up the next morning and I was actually kind of a mess. A lot of this is simply, anybody dying is tragic news, especially, unexpected it's going to have an impact on you. But then there's also obvious parallels, right? This is a father-daughter duo that died on the mountain that I was scheduled to climb the next day. And so not only was there empathy and grief for fellow human beings, but there becomes a bit of worry baked up in that as well, and all of those things kind of mix together. And so for the purposes of the rest of this intro, we're going to get a little bit into Wednesday the 4th here. So I wake up, I write that entry, and then I actually go and take a walk to the nearby church. There's a Catholic church less than a half a mile from the hostel, St. Martin of Tours there in Millinocket. I just go there, pray, kind of clear my head a little bit, and just ultimately get myself set up for the rest of the day. And that day, June 4th, ended up going well also, right? I ended up having a couple great conversations. You're going to hear at the very end of this entry that I actually was considering skipping Katahdin altogether, which would have been crazy in its own way as well. I'd actually thought about Katahdin for years at this point as being sort of the epic start of my journey, but I was kind of father first in that situation, and things did get scary. So I was thinking about, what if we took our ride into Baxter and just hiked south? Ultimately, that's not what happened. Like I said, I had some great conversations, kind of bolstered my confidence, and we'll get into that. Before we do, we've got the entry to go through, and before we get there, I do want to go ahead and do today's haiku. This one was written on October 4th, 2018. The ebb and the flow. Waves crash on the beach of life. The tide comes and goes. June 3rd, 2025. A sad day. Pre-trail. Truth be told, Haley and I had a great day. It started slowly with our southbound workshop at 2 p.m. The workshop was very good, and I feel confident that it filled the remaining gaps we needed. Very glad we did it. We made some purchases based on the knowledge, some we had planned anyway, went food shopping, organized the food we're going to hike with, and what we're leaving with the hostel for our food drop in the 100-mile wilderness. Despite our favorable experience, though, the day was overshadowed by tragedy on Katahdin. The news came in bits, and it's hard to say what pieces are fact and what are rumor. A man lost his life on the mountain, probably on Sunday. He was 58, hiking with his daughter, a 28-year-old. She remains missing. The full weight of this took a while to sink in, but as I write, it weighs heavily, as it should. I'll admit to being shaken. I think we're well prepared. Rumor is that they weren't. However, my hope is that they were more prepared than some think. Maybe the daughter took the gear and will turn up in town tomorrow. That's what I'd hope Haley would do. It's hard to imagine an AT through hike that just skips Katahdin and hikes south out of Baxter. But I'd be lying if I said the thought hasn't now crossed my mind. All right, let's go ahead and jump into that commentary. Usually you do have some transition music. You just heard some ads. Of course, as I mentioned, that's not happening this episode. So hopefully you're following me here in the transitions. One of the things that I really want to do in this episode is I want to introduce the people that were there at the AT hostel in Millinocket with Haley and me. And one of the best ways to do that is to kind of continue forward on the events of the morning of June 4th at this point. We'll get back and fill in a bit of the 3rd. But as I want to introduce people anyway, the mornings of the 4th are going to kind of give us a good framework. Because coming out of heading to the church, saying a few prayers, and just kind of centering myself, I had a few key conversations. Now, the first conversation was with Haley. One of the things that came to me as I was praying was that I really just needed to talk to my daughter, find out where she was. She had also gone through all of the same experiences that I had the previous day. And so what was she feeling? What was she thinking? She, to begin with, was in a lot more of a confident place than I was. And maybe some of that's just the dynamic, right? As the daughter in a father-daughter duo, she doesn't feel the same weight of responsibility that the father obviously would, right? So I think there's probably some of that. She wasn't feeling as worried as, it hit her, but it didn't hit her the same way. And that was good to know as I was contemplating the thing that you just heard in the entry, the idea of potentially even not setting foot on Katahdin in the first place. As I mentioned right before we got into that entry, that is not what happened. We would end up having an absolutely amazing day on Katahdin on Thursday, June 5th. So first of all, what am I doing hanging out at the hostel on June 4th when I was supposed to be early morning heading into Baxter, catching a shuttle and going in there? Well, what happened was we knew that the trails were closed due to the search and rescue, and the hostel had given us the option of just going in there later that day. June 4th, I had a reservation in Baxter State Park, not at the AT hostel, and so we would actually end up finishing that day in Baxter State Park, but we were hanging around for a little bit. As I had mentioned, I got done talking to Haley, and the next person I ended up coming across was a lady by the name of Won't Get Up Will. That was her trail name, Won't Get Up, Will. I actually just recently read an Instagram post, and she has been here in 2026 recently renamed by Graybeard. And if you don't know who Graybeard is the guy who is finishing up this year. As I had mentioned before, a thru hike is a calendar year. So he started last year on his, I want to say 85th birthday. I have to look that up, but Graybeard is setting the record for the oldest person ever to complete a thru hike. Apparently, recently met Won't Get Up Will and renamed her Goldilocks. But anyway, for Muse's Appalachian Trail story, this lady's name is Won't Get Up Will. She was a seasoned hiker in New England. She had come into the hostel probably at some point on the second. She was staying downstairs. Haley and I were staying upstairs with Dan and Michaela. We'll talk about Dan and Michaela in just a second. And so there were most people were kind of upstairs. She was kind of downstairs in a bunk. So I probably just didn't even notice her at first. I don't know when we got to the hostel there on the second. But we had hung out with her a bit on the third, and I'd already by the fourth, when I was having this conversation we're talking about, I'd gotten to know her a little bit. She was there not actually doing an AT thru hike. People will be on the trail, and they're often doing a number of different potential things. Hers was interesting, and I'll have to get the details on this and maybe fill you in on it later, but she was doing something that coincided with the AT for a while. She was climbing a bunch of peaks. But again, she wasn't necessarily, like, it was just coinciding with the AT. It really wasn't the AT itself that she was doing. I would end up meeting Won't Get Up Will a couple of times later on. Haley and I would run into her again at Shaw's in Munson, and then I would see her again at the hostel in Maine in Carabasset Valley. Won't Get Up Will was a seasoned hiker. She had summited Katahdin a number of times. In fact, that's what she was doing. One of the mountains she was ascending in what she was doing in 2025 was Katahdin, and she had done that on June 1st. The mountain was open on June 1st. It was the first day that it was open for the season. And then, of course, it closed down again until the 5th. She had said that Katahdin was pretty brutal on the first. She had kind of just gone up there, sort of tagged the peak, came back down, and visibility was pretty bad, and the weather conditions were pretty rough. But the things that she said to me that were so important was just basically that Haley and I have this. I mean, I'm talking to her on the 4th. She had just observed us yesterday in a southbound workshop. We were geared up. We had all this knowledge from that workshop. We were going to be okay. The other thing that Won't Get Up Will did was she actually gave me a bunch of practical tips, and I ended up buying some meal bars from the outfitter because of some of the tips that she gave me. But she's like, you need to fuel up this way, you need to hydrate this way, and get your water here, and here's how you want to think about the ascent of Katahdin. So it was great. Talking to her, I not only have a little extra confidence now, I also have some practical advice. And so this is starting to already seem a bit doable. And then the next person I talked to was a gentleman by the name of Squatch. Squatch worked for the hostel, and he was a 2024 thru hiker. I believe he's actually a northbound thru hiker. And he was up there in 2025 working for the AT hostel, and he had a certain goal that was regarding going up Katahdin. I want to say the goal, as I remember it, was something like he wanted to set the record for the number of times Katahdin was summited in a season. I actually don't know whether he set that record or not. At least it's not searchable on the internet. I do know that he set the record for the fastest known time going up Katahdin. Car to car, so exiting his car, summiting, getting back to his car, 3 hours, 22 minutes, and 10 seconds. And we actually first got that news at Food Drop, which would be roughly a week after the events that we're talking about. And Squatch had also been up on Katahdin on June 1st. He had been up there with another guy from the hostel by the name of Moses. And the other thing about Squatch is that on June 3rd, that Tuesday, Squatch was actually in the workshop with us. So somebody who had been, very much firsthand seeing how we had prepared. And he said, you guys are fine. You guys are prepared. So by the time I talked to Haley, by the time I talked to Won't Get Up Will, and by the time I talked to Squatch, I was feeling pretty good there on Wednesday, and we made the decision. We're going to go ahead and do it. All right, some other people that were there at the AT hostel with us. I had mentioned Dan and Michaela in last Wednesday's episode because we first saw them in the bus station in Bangor. So they were on the bus from Bangor to Medway. Obviously, the Shudway from Medway to the hostel with us as well. And they actually coincided with us the whole time we were at the hostel, the whole time we're in Baxter State Park, and we're also going to see them often in the 100-mile wilderness. So you're going to hear these names again. Michaela would eventually leave the trail right around Rangeley, and Dan would continue alone. Dan would eventually become known as Metronome because he was writing rhyming couplets in the shelter logs, some of them long, some of them short, but he was writing poetry as well. So I'm writing haikus, he's writing these rhyming poems, and we'd kind of get associated with each other. And I remember going for weeks, especially somewhere in the stretch from, I don't know, call it Carabasset Valley to the end of Maine. People would constantly be asking me, how have you met Metronome? And I would be like, nope, haven't met him yet. I hope I run into him sometime. Ran into him at the Barn Hostel in Gorham and found out that Metronome was in fact Dan, who I had effectively started the hike with. So that was kind of funny. May as well go ahead and round out who was in that shuttle from Medway. There was this guy, Matt. He had only one night at the hostel, whereas the rest of us all had two. I'm not even sure exactly what he did because the trails were closed on June 3rd, so maybe he just went south and he came back and got Katahdin or something. Never saw him again, but that happens, right? You heard me saying that with Ratatouille on Friday, that some people you'll meet one time, some people you'll run back into again. Another guy that we met at the AT hostel was a guy named Kevin, and we would have at least a little bit of a longer association with him. I think he also had only one night at the hostel, if I'm not mistaken, but his night at the hostel was June 3rd. So he went into Baxter State Park with us on the 4th, and I chatted with him a little bit in Baxter. We would run into him while ascending Katahdin. Last time I ever saw him was while going up Katahdin. So who else? I mentioned Loins of Arabia before because she was driving the shuttle from Medway. She and her husband, Trash Panda, they run the AT hostel. And I'd actually been in contact with Trash Panda before the hike. He was one of those people who really helped shape a lot of my May preparation through the tips and tricks I got with him. He and I had been exchanging emails for a few weeks. Good folks. They were expecting their first child when we were there, so I imagine there's a little hiker up there in Millinocket just waiting to hit the trail, like as soon as they start walking and stuff, I suppose. Another guy in Millinocket there that I want to mention is this guy Trip. And this is somebody, and I just didn't know what I didn't know, but he was the Ridge Runner in 2025 for somewhere near the end of the 100-mile wilderness. And so a Ridge Runner is somebody who does some light trail maintenance, does some education, especially Leave No Trace, and they just kind of assist hikers a little bit. So this sounds like, I mean, even as I describe it, that sounds like somebody I'm going to run into again. So I never even said a proper goodbye to Trip because it was just assumed. I think Haley said the same thing. We never even said goodbye to the guy because we just assumed we were going to run into him again. Truth is, once I got on trail, I never met a Ridge Runner. So I guess I didn't know what I didn't know. But Trip, he was awesome. He was this really energetic, really excitable guy, and also really helpful. Like Haley was trying to do a project with some embroidery string. He happened to have some in his car and gave it to her. That was cool. And then he also, after the workshop, offered to take Haley and I food shopping. So we went food shopping. Trip was our ride there, and we just hung out for a little bit. We ended up having McDonald's with him afterwards. I actually remember McDonald's, and this is now we've gotten to the third, right? We've gone backwards in time. We've gotten to the third. So the night of the third, we're at McDonald's with Trip, and that was when he got the message that he was going to be on the search and rescue cruise the next day. Because Trip, as a Ridge Runner, he was on the payroll, if you will, of the MATC, the Maine Appalachian Trail Club. So they got involved in that, and I just remember that hitting him kind of hard that he had to do that. Last person I'll mention there in Millinocket is Sweets, because I ended up talking to Sweets a number of times because she was running the register at the outfitter, and I was into the outfitter a few times while I was dialing in gear when I was there. So ran into Sweets a number of times. She also would be the person who would answer the phone, so I got to talk to a familiar voice from the 100-mile wilderness because we would end up rescheduling our food drop. We would have been, I think it was 2 days late. I don't remember. We'll get there when we get there. That's about a week away. Well, that's about a week away in trail time. The funny things about this timeline that I set up is we cover 3, sometimes even only 2 days on trail every 7 days. And so, I don't know, you may hear about that phone call that I'm talking about in like 2 weeks or something like that, or 3 weeks. Okay, I do want to, and I think we're probably going a little bit long, so maybe I'll keep it just to summary here. But I do want to talk a bit about the 3rd. Like I mentioned in the entry, despite the fact that it got overshadowed and I was feeling the impact of that more on the 4th, so it was natural to talk a little bit more about the 4th and the 3rd during this episode, the 3rd was actually an exciting, fun day. So we start the day, the workshop is at 2 p.m. So we've got an appointment at 2 o'clock, right? So it's a lot like the previous day in a way, where we've got the morning to just chill out. One of the funny things about the days that we were in Millinocket, though, is that where the hostel is placed is this funny, almost sort of downtown Main Street sort of area that is just not happening. There's actually a lot more to Millinocket than meets the eye when you first get there, as I realized when I walked to that church, or when Tripp brought us to, I think it was Walmart, I'm not sure, wherever we went food shopping. There's a bit more to the town. It's not as small and quaint as you first think. But the spot where the hostel is, it is very small and quaint. And nothing's open. So on Monday night, we had gotten pizza when we had gotten there, and it was delicious pizza. I don't know, maybe Maine specializes in delicious pizza. I have no idea. But stuff on this Main Street was really kind of happening on that Monday night, June 2nd, when we first got there, and we had our pizza, we got settled in and all that. But then that pizza, except for McDonald's with Tripp, was basically the last meal we really had in Millinocket. All of the other ones were really kind of filled in by this little general store. So it was a lot of like chips and just snacks and stuff like that, because that was like Haley and I were wandering around, and that was the only thing we could really find. So that was kind of funny. So we're wandering around, we're enjoying. The weather's beautiful here in Maine in early June, and we're just wandering around town, and we're just kind of chilling out for the most part. We get to the actual workshop, and the workshop was really cool. Trash Panda ran the workshop, and Squatch was there as one of the people he was training. There was also, I have the advantage, you're going to hear this later on, Haley reminded me of Bubbles' name, so sorry, Bubbles, if you hear this, but Bubbles was there as well. And the reason you'll hear that later on is because Haley's our next interview episode, and I've already had that interview. So Squatch and Bubbles, they're learning from Trash Panda how to run these workshops, because they're on the hostel staff that year, and they're going to run a bunch of those workshops going on. Quick reminder here, we're some of the first people to even come through, because it's early June and Katahdin never opens before Memorial Day at the earliest. And Memorial Day in 2025, Katahdin had 18 inches of snow, right? Which is, why it was open for the first time ever on June 1st. The details of the workshop, I think they're going to come out as I kind of talk topically about those things. So you'll probably hear me in future episodes just saying, and I learned this in the workshop, and maybe hearing that a few times. And that'll be good to kind of bring that out this way. The overall vibe of the workshop, though, was just really cool. It was informative. It was affirming. And it just felt like we're sending you out there ready, and you can just tackle this. First, Katahdin and the wilderness. The workshop really did zero in on Katahdin and the wilderness. The idea being that you get through all of that, the rest of the hike is just kind of gravy, right? Like you've learned a lot of your lessons, and while you'll continue learning lessons for sure, you've really gotten through the most of it. And that's very much true. They set that up that way. That's a good way to set it up. Let's see, just high level, what did we learn about? We learned about what the terrain of Katahdin was like, what we could expect on Katahdin. We learned a bit about what we could expect in the 100-mile wilderness. We talked about fording streams and rivers. We talked about hanging bear bags. And we talked about the Far Out app. And then there was a shakedown here, as I had mentioned before. And we went through gear and also proper nutrition on trail. So yeah, those are some of the topics that we'll get into later on that we got a really good overview on there in the workshop. And with that, I think I'll go ahead and leave this episode right there. Don't forget to follow or subscribe there in your podcast app if you haven't done that yet. And hit me up on Instagram at musehikes or email me at museatpodcast@gmail.com. Next episode, actually, I don't know precisely what next episode will be. We'll see what'll happen, because when I am sitting here recording, I am actually headed to Trail Days in Damascus today. And this episode is going to air next Monday when I will have just returned. Depending on what happens at Trail Days, I might modify what the episode after today is. So Wednesday's episode might be some Trail Days magic. It might be the next day on trail. Not absolutely sure. We'll see how that works out. But either way, until then, this has been Muse. You've been listening to Muse's AT Podcast. Thank you for walking with me, and happy trails.